Howdy, welcome. Glad you all could join us. We are here at the 6th Tulane School of Architecture Spring Lecture of our 2020-2021 series, Inhabiting the Planet. So in this lecture series, we analyze and discuss the way humans are and could be inhabiting the planet from different perspectives and how architecture intersects with social, racial, environmental, economic, and health issues. Tonight, we're joined by Bryan Lee Jr. for a discussion about design justice, power, and place. Tonight's lecture is the annual Mary W. and Arthur Q. Davis Lecture, and we thank the donors for their continued support of this lecture series. Since these events are virtual, we want to make them as dynamic as possible. So after his presentation, Bryan will be joined by two respondents for a conversation. The two respondents here on the screen with me are Craig Barton, professor of the practice in architecture at Brown University, where he's also an architect, and Edson Kabelfin, who is our Dean of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at Tulane School of Architecture. He's the Director of Social Innovation and Social Entrepreneurship and a professor of practice in design thinking. So many titles, Edson. So after a discussion amongst the three presenters, they will take questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A. Brevity is great. There's a button at the bottom of your screen, and either the speakers or staff will read them out loud. So to make a quick introduction, I'll introduce you to our main lecturer, Bryan. Bryan's an architect, educator, speaker, writer, and design justice advocate. He's the founder and design principal at Co-Locate Design, a nonprofit multidisciplinary design practice here in New Orleans, Louisiana, dedicated to expanding community access to design and creating spaces of racial, social, and cultural equity. I can't speak right now. He's a design critic at Harvard GSD and has led 2 award-winning youth community design programs. He is a founding co-organizer of the Design as Protest Collective and Dark Matter University. He was most recently honored as one of the 2018 Fast Company Most Creative People in Business, a USC Annenberg MacArthur Civic Media Fellow, and the youngest design firm to win the Architectural League's Emerging Voices Award in 2019. I just wanted to say too, on top of those official titles, that Bryan's a friend of mine and a friend of the school's, and is always generous with his time, like tonight. And he's been part of many of our small center design juries, and is, I think in all the ways he engages, is consistently challenging all of us to make design more equitable, inclusive, and just challenging us to be better at what we do, both in process and in outcome. So welcome, Bryan, to the School of Architecture and our lecture series, and we're excited to hear what you have to say.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily. I do appreciate it. Craig, Edson, thank you so much for joining today. This is truly amazing to kind of be in this space again, theoretically, metaphorically, virtually at home here in New Orleans with folks. And so I wanted to talk about some of the work that we've done locally, and I wanted to kind of focus on the foundation, what we call ground setting in our work, and why that's valuable. It's going to have a bit of a deeper conversation around the kind of socio-spatial and geospatial kind of politics of architecture, and we'll take that into a little bit of the architecture itself, but then we'll have a little bit of a broader conversation around what it means to think about power and its relationship to the places and spaces that we design. So without further ado, I will get us moving. So again, thank you so much for the invitation to speak this evening. This conversation, as I mentioned, is about design justice. It's about what it means to consider power as a in relationship to the places and spaces we design. Again, a lot of the work that we talk about stems from a deep, abiding consideration for activism and advocacy in the built environment and its relationship to the built, like I said, its relationship to the built environment. In my past, I've worked on different campaigns around removing racist monuments in the city. I've worked on political campaigns when I was in college, and housing campaigns both here in the city and prior to moving to New Orleans. And in all of that work, the kind of foundational considerations are really based on a kind of colloquial nature in which we organize ourselves around space. So a habitually juxtaposed against a greater frequency than chance. So we take that to mean, from the perspective of co-locate, this beautiful definition that talks about a sequence of words and phrases habitually juxtaposed with one another at a greater frequency than chance. So for the perspective of a design practice, we are thinking about the sequence of people in place habitually juxtaposed with one another at a greater frequency than chance. And all of that wraps itself around 4 kind of core values: understanding power, understanding our values and their kind of implicit or their kind of implications on the built environment, and then care. Right? And the recognition that power, the history of all revolutions, is based in blood and land, the landless versus the landlord. It is rarely acquitted. We are rarely acquitted to handle revolution. We're rarely acquitted to change the systems that we keep saying that we want to change, in large part because we're afraid to sacrifice in large ways. We have been made comfortable, and that's what systems are meant to do, is to make us comfortable enough not to challenge power at its highest levels. And so we then have to understand that our values then seep into the architecture. Our collective values are validated through the spaces and places we design. And so in racist systems, we create monuments to the hubris of violence and white supremacy through the built environment. That fundamentally requires us to, in order to challenge that and to make sure that our values are experienced through the built environment. When I say our values, not just the designers, specifically the communities we're serving, we have to recognize that what care means, right? Design justice is what love looks like in public spaces. So spatial design should be a deep reflection of our beloved communities, expressed in physical form. That means that if we want to have care and concern for a beloved community, we actually have to be in community with folks. Right? We actually have to know people beyond the experiences, the kind of spatial experiences they have. What experiences do they have more broadly in community? And so if we are a part of that community, we actually have a better sense of how that manifests. So all that to say that for nearly every injustice in the world, there is an architecture, a plan, a design that is built to sustain it. Well, if we're thinking about design justice from its just pure definition standpoint, we're talking about a way for us to forward a radically anti-racist vision for racial, social, cultural reparation through the process and outcomes of design. Now, I say radical because we're attempting to get to the root of particular issues before we move forward. I say reparation because we're asking ourselves to repair before proposing. I say process and outcomes because it's not enough just to have a beautiful building. It is necessary that our process speaks to our values, speaks to the relationships that we understand about power, and speaks to the care that we have for our communities. And then on the other side of that, using all of that as a tool, we have to recognize that design justice calls on us to challenge the privilege and power structures that use architecture and design as a tool of oppression, right? So if we're thinking about all of the issues we face in this world, whether that's climate change or housing issues or transportation, economic injustice, police violence, in what ways is the built environment a scaffolding for those considerations to manifest, to grow, to be harmful and traumatic in so many communities? And then how do we face them? How do we acknowledge the fact that our ability to divest and reallocate police funding is fundamentally a question of the kind of spatial politics of policing in our environments. Our ability to abolish the carceral state requires us to consider the sheer amplification of spaces of torture, spaces to imprison people over time. We have to recognize the kind of capital nature by which those spaces are bound to our systems. If we want to think about policing and abolishing larger carceral states, then we have to recognize that we have to cease the kind of implementation of hostile architecture and landscapes in our work. If we think about design justice through these lenses, then we also have to recognize that we have to center community leadership. We have to cultivate anti-racist visions for affordable, just neighborhoods. We have to think about the preservation of Black, Brown, and Indigenous and Asian cultures in public spaces. Because the more we understand and see people as human, the dignity that we provide to people in public spaces is akin to the kind of care that we are speaking about. And then we have to restructure our relationship to power and our understanding of architecture as an act of labor, right? The tilling of lands. We always talk about the fact that Freedmen's Bureau often, if we think about 1863, 1865, as the Freedmen Bureau was taking a 7-year run at thinking about reparations for formerly enslaved people, there was a pastor who talked about the fact that tilling the lands, the ability to have land, to till land, and to use to reap the rewards of that labor would allow for liberation to actually be attained for enslaved people or formerly enslaved people. So our relationship to labor is tremendously important in that we have to then create new models for how we exchange knowledge and learn and license ourselves. We have to then think about our relationship to policies and kind of liberatory practice in itself. So design justice calls on us to juggle a lot of things, but all of these things are things that we think about consistently as a practice, and a lot of you are thinking about in your day-to-day work. Now, in that work, there are processes and steps that we take as a practice that I want to kind of just be clear about, because they're ever present when we talk about the work here in New Orleans. But in every city that we work in, we see some dynamic that makes these relationships between outreach, engagement, and organizing very, very clear. And so, for instance, as we think about how we push our work into how we work with communities and through communities to build spaces, what does it mean to think about outreach, right? To think about outreach as a form of pure communication, one that doesn't necessarily seek to do anything other than distribute information to a broader community as a checkbox. That's one kind of version, one end of the spectrum. Engagement oftentimes seeks communication and feedback. It is varying levels of engagement and feedback, but ultimately it's seeking some version of a dialogue. It's often extractive, it's often singular in its survey basis. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we're talking about organizing. So what does that mean for strategic mobilization to think about the way we build power in communities and build power through this idea of, or these kind of considerations of new architectures coming into communities, right? Are being built with communities. It's very hard to get to the end of that spectrum towards organizing. Kind of capital mechanisms of building architecture don't always allow us to receive, to get to that end. But the more we are able to kind of build power with communities and shift the kind of political voice, the better off we are. In this work, we often talk about design as protest, and protest is to have an unyielding faith in the power and potential of a just society. It is a way for us to describe power. Describing power means that we are we're opening up space to articulate how power has been abusive in particular contexts. And so how do we think about design as a tool of protest? one that describes what power does and what power continues to do if not checked, right? And in doing so, we recognize the small kind of but discrete nuances that are necessary to pinpoint, whether that's the difference between neighborhoods and communities, whether that's the kind of continuum of power that suggests a relationship between pedagogy, policies and procedures, practice, projects, and people. These are all extremely important. When we talk about architecture, has often found its way to this cozy little niche that says we are too big to challenge these kind of very precise, unique issues on the ground. But we are also too small to deal with and challenge these larger issues. We found this cozy space in which we don't actually have to do anything. We don't actually have to address the issues of our society. We purely have to create architecture that takes people outside of their daily existence and transposes them into new environments that have no kind of entanglement with the broader context of their lives. We, in earnest, have to recognize that these relationships are paramount. We cannot just focus on projects. We have to understand that our work is applicable across and up and down these spectrums. So often we're just simply afraid to address the real issues. We're afraid to deal with the fact that we inherently exist in a racist system, and we are inherently complicit often in those racist systems. And so with privilege and power, depending on your background, the privilege and power you have, the privilege and power that you use is one way for us to kind of continue to challenge those systems. It is our obligation to understand, to actively recognize or racialize and socialize biases and actively seek to dismantle those privilege and power systems as best we can. And that requires us to do 4 things, which you'll see in a few of our projects moving forward. It requires us, when we're thinking about anti-racism, when we're thinking about liberation through our work, we're actively seeking to change and shift narratives, acknowledging established and lived histories in particular places. It requires us to think about mutual aid. What ways are we building structures that support the needs of our broader community through this work? It requires us then to dismantle and decolonize both our own thinking and dismantle the systems to which we are currently operating under. And then lastly, which oftentimes is forgotten in organizing and movement work, is that there's a need, an absolute need, and you see it more presently in movement work, but there's an absolute need to think about what future setting is. How can we set grounds for what the future might look like in an anti-racist space and a liberatory space? All of these things are absolutely necessary. They are not singular in their efforts. We must combine all of our efforts to kind of push some of these things forward. And in order to be anti-racist in this work, we then have to understand what racism is. It means that we have to understand that racism itself is a system that relies on unconscious cultivated biases of their operators, right? Right. These are the things that we have to actually recognize, that sometimes the act of a racist is in support, almost all times an act of a racist is in support of a larger system, and the comfort by which the system applies to the racist or to the operator is the thing that propels the system along. It allows people to navigate, or the system to operate, without having to bear the burden of empathizing with those it harms. And so all of these isms that we face in our world, they are a palimpsest. They continue to layer on top of one another. And so the forces of the isms, whether it's racism, sexism, ableism, they are all layered on top of one another. as are the kind of results of these isms, the ways in which our communities form to protect one another. We are all part of multiple communities, and the way that we recognize those separate identities and those kind of connected identities in ourselves allows us to then shape the cultures that we identify with. Right? Culture is often what we talk about is the kind of culture is the consequence of persistent circumstance and immediate condition. Culture is a collective coping mechanism, one that is a necessary trauma response. And often folks don't necessarily want to see culture identified through the lens of trauma, and that's fine. But what I want to just kind of bring to light here is that, and this is where we start to get into the kind of framing of the architecture, the spatial implications of the architecture. Culture shapes our patterns, our routines, our habits, our tendencies in space, the things that we do, how much time we have to do them. And it's a response to that. It allows us to kind of cope with the kind of spatial physical conditions of our built environment, and allows us to orient our collective selves in order to negotiate those environments. And so in this, as we understand racism as a force, and we understand communities as the object, and we understand culture as the response to those forces applied to an object, we have to understand what direction we are seeking to go, right? We have to understand that what injustice actually looks like. It is really an imbalanced system that maintains an effort to, it's an effort to maintain and retain power to some extent. So on the other end of that spectrum, what are we looking to do? If we're seeking justice and if we're seeking liberation, then we have to repair for past injustices. We have to stabilize in the present and remove barriers to progress moving forward. So liberation then calls on us to take it one step further to affirmatively influence our future outcomes. So in that process, it calls on us to honor the griot, or honor our ancestors, our elders, our storytellers, to make sure that we're seeking power in place, to understand that culture is evolution and revolution. That means that we're lifting our present stories and recognizing that our stories take time to evolve, and culture kind of shapes itself over time. Land is liberation, the way that people own and have ownership of land and its subsequent kind of architecture that is applied to that land. That means the world to people, right? That gives power to people. It is redistributed in a way that serves a broader kind of consideration. Form follows fiction. Oftentimes in communities that have historically been disinherited or simply disinherited from space, the narratives of place are even more important. The narratives that get bound to the physical spaces of a place are every bit as important. So the form of an architecture may not always look like the prototypical Western canonized architecture that we often relate to, but the form following those fictions will lead us into a new way of envisioning architecture that ultimately serves a broader set of communities than we presently do. So I want to just kind of quickly talk through what we think about as the critical path to design injustice, and then start to show a few projects that start to speak more broadly to that. And again, whether we're talking about a timeline that thinks about the Black codes as a kind of spatial consideration, Plessy versus Ferguson as well, modernism stripping out the kind of considerations of culture in our work, Euclid versus Ambler, which kind of reified some of the police powers into physical spaces. We know that in 37, we saw the redlining, we saw federal housing authorities start to establish redlining in our work, in our cities, and we start to see the kind of remnants of that still impacting our cities today, whether that was project housing in the 40s and kind of suburbanization in the later 40s, Highways Act in the 50s, slum clearances in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. SEPTED being implemented in the 70s, HUD being completely wiped out in terms of its kind of dollars in the late 80s to the early 90s. all of these things, and this list could go on and on and on in both directions, but fundamentally, there is a groundwork that we are constantly fighting against in order to understand the climate and the landscape of the sites that we work on in this world. And so if we don't have the context to understand how we move forward, we will continue to recreate the traumas of a past when we actually just really don't have to. It may not look the same. It may not look like someone yelling at Mini Jean Tricky in Little Rock that you do not belong here. It may not look like the colored entrance sign to this young woman at the department store in Alabama. But the residue and the residual of these impacts still lies on the souls, on the spirit, on the culture of certain communities. We know where we can be, we know where we can't be, we know precisely how these spaces have treated us in the past. It is ingrained often in our hearts and souls. But recognizing that revolution comes through the claiming of space, it requires us to think about the fact that even our ancestors and elders and our present day contemporaries are actively seeking to hold space, using architecture as a tool to maintain and claim one's liberation through the architecture of our environments. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about what we call the functional needs of the built environment. These are a way for us to kind of identify the types of projects that serve at their highest level, and how can all of our projects start to actually aim at some sort of combinatorial consideration of this work. So in one, we're talking about housing in this previous collective shelter and housing. I want to talk about a smaller project that we did from the organizing side here in the city a few years back, 2015. And still, we still kind of carry on in some way and fashion. But Blights Out was a kind of cultural activation that started to talk about vacant properties in this city. So we knew post-Katrina that there were 25 to 50,000 vacant properties, and this was a radical kind of cultural process to ask and detangle some of those conversations. So diagramming what the housing crisis actually looked like in this city, the amount of work that had to go into getting one lot back into commission. It meant that we had to organize and work with property owners and artists and community members to talk about what it meant to bring this work back into light and to actually bring these lots back to a space of consciousness in our kind of spatial imaginary. So we work with young people across the city to actually design a series of yard signs and billboards that started to do just that. We ran for president and for mayor, and worked again with young people to kind of describe what we were seeing in these places, whether we were seeing housing being used as class warfare or development in these places. We were calling for development without displacement. We used the language of the second line to walk around and understand the survey of condemned housing and vacant properties. This house that you see here actually burnt down about 1.5 years after this work. But again, being able to kind of view and survey and talk about, understand the ground setting, the groundwork of property before actually building onto something. This project originally started as a means for us to actually build kind of workforce housing for artists across the city. But what it turned out was a kind of research assessment of a complicated process that continues to extract from New Orleans residents daily. On the other end of that spectrum, again, we ran for mayor and we talked about what disaster capitalism looks like. We talked about kind of neighborhood cell blocks. We talked about the constitutional articles that kind of prevent progress in these areas, and brought ourselves to a position of public conversation around what vacancy and condemned properties look like in this city. And so Greater New Orleans Housing Authority is continuing to press some of this work along, and we continue to support them in that effort. Some of you may know one of the larger projects we've done in the city more recently, which is a collaboration with so many folks across the city, but also just a team effort from the Paper Mayim's Co-Locate team, which was a planning process. It was one that was steeped in the context of removal of racist monuments in this city. We asked ourselves to imagine new monuments to New Orleans. And in that, we started to make sure that we collected thousands of proposals and talked to thousands of people about what it meant for them to see what new monuments might look like in the city. And we reflected those back to the public. We made sure that we cultivated that work and made sure that it was public to folks on a consistent basis. We work with authors and artists when we talk about building community. This was a part of that effort. I'm sure there are many people on this call who are part of this effort in some capacity. We publicly expressed this care back into communities. We reframed and rethought about what narratives of history look like. As we talked about earlier, when we talked about what anti-racist and liberatory practice looks like, this is a part of it. And this is the groundwork, right, to a broader, more public process that will eventually have in architecture, or will eventually have new monuments across this city. But this was kind of the groundwork that helps that happen, right? We wanted to make sure that these spaces had the opportunity to weather and take on the conditions of the environment, whether it was artists painting over a piece, or the weather kind of fading the artwork, or just the kind of fights of public space that people often have. Some people stole these pieces or took them and put them in their house. And so we had to deal and contend with all of those. And what we wanted to really just show is that the stories, the narratives of our built environment are often shrouded in the same way. They get masked sometimes, they get painted over, they get scrubbed. So all of that is conditional. We like to think about this as a project that started to reframe the way that these narratives exist in our physical environment. We try to restore the complexity in those environments and leverage some of the systems that we have in this city, whether that's our public transit systems, our libraries, civic infrastructure, cultural institutions, so on and so forth. We talk to young students and students in college. We occupied physical space to tell these stories. And we documented and made those public. And so these are now available through the Midlow Center, one of our partners in this work. And we captured what it meant for us to consider culture in the city, family, legacies, women in this city, and tried to reflect those back over and over. And one of the things that's not mentioned is that we produced nearly 15,000 newspapers that we distributed across the entire city to kind of reflect the voice of community members in this process. And in that work, again, centering the voice of communities rather than centering the voice of individuals, I think was part of this process. And so I wanted to talk lastly about two projects. Quickly was a concept project that we worked on with the Claiborne Innovation District. One that started very much in the same way, collecting and understanding what the narratives of communities were. We talked with experts, we talked with our elders, we talked with business people and artists, talked with our youth, who all shaped this 19-block 19-block reimagining of the Claiborne underpass that really started to ask ourselves, how might we restitch this part of the community that had been, or part of this neighborhood that had been run through with a highway that separated out 400 businesses, which we lost, over 400 live oak trees over time, and to use those histories as a methodology for us to kind of build on, right? Building on the Claiborne Avenue design team's work in the 70s, the work of those in the mid 2000s, or 2011 to 2013, which went through and surveyed thousands and thousands of more people to kind of talk about how they wanted to interpret or engage this space. And then ultimately thinking about a design that reflected the needs of business folks, specifically Black businesses along the corridor, which reflected some of the needs for certain people, and ultimately reflected a substantial amount of need for Black and brown businesses, about 95% of which, were 1 to 3 people throughout the entirety of their existence. Now, what that meant was that we couldn't ask people to continue to jump into new houses or into new buildings or new construction, because the tax rates, the way in which the property would continue to burden them over time was unsustainable. And so what would an architecture look like that wasn't full of kind of the necessary ego pushing folks into a particular type of architecture, but built to a scale and to a size that was adaptable and amenable to the conditions that we know exist. And so that's part of what you see in some of these concept images, which start to drive and reflect the need to maintain the underpass as a way for what we know St. Joseph's Night, for Mardi Gras, for Second Lines, all to still interact underneath this corridor, and then to reflect the elders. So the last thing that I want to talk about before we close out is just simply some of the organizing work that we've been doing around these principles over the last year. So when George Floyd was, we're marking a pretty remarkable day today, in that Officer Chauvin is on trial for the murder of George Floyd. And while a lot of us have been working on organizing work prior to that particular moment, it felt like in that moment, there were more people willing and able to continue or bring their whole selves to this fight. And in that moment, we started just a simple national call to have public conversation around this work. There were over 1,300 people who showed up to those initial calls. And in that work, we started to build out this collective. These demands were reflected a little earlier, but in that work, we saw thousands of letters sent out to firms across the country, to politicians across the city, to politicians across the country, to agencies and organizations, to sign on to the demands and to commit to kind of an anti-racist and liberatory practice in that work. We see organizers from all across the country presently. And we've organized under a couple monikers, which you may know. Again, DAP Collective is one, Dark Matter University you may have heard of. But it's deeper than that. Again, our ability to kind of tell stories, to do and think about direct actions, to think about policy, our connections to policy, to organize across the board, whether that's, again, professionals, students, and the like. And so in that, we've seen just the kind of standard updates online. We've told stories as a way to kind of shift and tell narratives about space. We've worked on voter registration drives across the country. We've seen live actions where we produced kind of public occupiable architecture that started to be built in a way that can speak to the issues that we're talking about. We've seen one, this one right here was actually produced outside of City Hall last year. So I wanted to kind of end here because in large part, the actions and the scale of these actions and the scale of the architecture you're seeing is maybe not what you've always been used to in these lectures. And I wanted to kind of shift that for a reason, because I think often we're not able to move our mindset out of the singularity of wanting to have one type of architecture. And I hope that in these conversations, as we start to build on what it means to be an anti-racist architect, or what it means to work in the field of design justice, it is one that meets people where they are, that is a part of community and recognizes the power distribution that is necessary in our work, that validates and honors the values of individuals on the ground, and that reflects our deep, unabiding care for ourselves, for our communities, and for the work we do in this world. So thank you for taking the time to hear me out, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. All right. There we go. So thank you, Craig.
Thank you.
How you doing?
No, it's great to meet you, and I'll defer to my colleague in New Orleans. I'm the guest, so I will let you go first, Edson.
Craig, I was just gonna say, please go ahead. You're our guest too.
All right. Well, we're all being polite. So Bryan, it's hard to know where to begin, except to first thank you for building a pedagogy, a practice both imbued with generosity, with intellectual verve, and as you to take your own, to essentially quote you, and forgive me if I'm misquoting you, to really help reset the future. Those are extraordinarily powerful points of departure, and often they are left only as memes. And here they've been considered, developed, and actualized. It's really extraordinary. So I'm honored to be in your presence, and I'm thankful that there are people like you pushing this work forward. I'm going to try to make my comments brief, but to say, there was so much to take in. I'm trying to think, well, how do I in some way do this? So I'm going to take a mariner's trick to try to triangulate, right? I'm going to try to triangulate through three points of view. One, through Hannah Arendt talking about the space of public appearance. One, through Cornel West in The New Politics of Cultural Difference, talking about seizing the means of controlling the means of representation and production. And one through the novelist Ralph Ellison talking about questions of visibility. And I use these 3 points of reference to somehow, and I don't want to say I'm trying to capture your work, but really to, in some way, try to, in my own words, find a way to talk about what I see as an extraordinary idea about claiming space, redistributing power, and essentially identifying places in which people who have otherwise been told you don't belong here have been able to take root. to me, that is in its own way embedded in the question of memory, and memory as a form of being visible, memory as a form of being rooted and a part of a place that you've been told that you've not been able to be a part of. To me, that speaks to the language of Ellison and questions of visibility. How is it that we make communities visible more broadly? To rent the question of being visible in the space of public appearance, that place in which you exercise political power, not only as an individual, but collectively as a community. And to West, the idea that part and parcel of being able to be visible in these communities is, in fact, rather being visible in the space of appearance. It seems to me is for the intellectual challenge. He names three. The key challenge is to be able to control the means of representation. And I think that in the new politics of cultural difference, the most perhaps powerful reference to architects and designers is this idea of being able to control the terms of representation. What I find so powerful about your work is the way in which you work at a number of scales, both in the imaginary and in the practical, in the métier of actually built material, and in the métier of the dream. And so I'm going to leave my comments there, and I'll open the opportunity for Edson to begin the conversation between the three of us. But I hope that gives you some sense of I don't know if I'd characterize it as reverence, but we'll use a spiritual metaphor today. Reverence, in which I have found the work that you do, and look forward to engaging in the conversations with the group in the audience today.
Thank you, Brian, also for such a very inspiring talk. I think like one of the things that really struck me with your lecture is the notion of how we're able to really sort of look at how power operates in architecture in the built environment. One thing that struck me also was how looking at the idea of radicalization and the idea of revolution as happening on kind of multiple scales, multiple levels, and also sort of like multiple facets and dimensions. And one thing that then sort of like led me to think about when you were talking earlier was the idea of actually love. You mentioned it as part of, you're talking about the power, you're talking about values and about care. And the idea of love is for me sort of very poignant because sort of like in kind of architecture, sometimes we don't talk about love and we don't talk about care. In terms of like looking at, as you kind of like pointed out, historically, architecture has been an instrument of extraction, an instrument of marginalization, a kind of tool for segregation, and all of different ways by which then as architects, as designers, then as you pointed out, we are really complicit. And so we're kind of like in this system where that sense of care is actually taken out because we don't really, in a way, care about the people who we are sort of supposedly be serving and or taking care of. And then so I think like putting that back into kind of the frame makes it, I think, like in a way, like for me, like it kind of like creates a very radical position. One thing that maybe like I wanted to ask also immediately is to maybe like thinking about the root of it's a very complex system, as you kind of like pointed out. But one of the element that I'm also curious to hear, maybe like for you to comment on, is education. And I'm kind of speaking from the point of view of, and I'm sure Craig also is also sort of talking about it in terms of like how architecture education sort of contributes, if not creates such a framework by which then, as you pointed out, we become instruments of this marginalization and oppression. And I wonder what you thought about how do we then change architecture education to be able to kind of shift then and our attention, and then, as you say, to create maybe this revolution, because there's so much there's so much in the current architectural education system where we are not maybe questioning like this sort of the process that we've been so embedded in, that we tend not to then sort of want to rock the boat or want to change it because we're so comfortable already. But what you're proposing is really to kind of break it, to challenge the system and to dismantle the system. But in my kind of mind also, then that means that you are going to almost, if you're going to dismantle some of these systems of oppression within architecture, and architecture is part of that system of oppression, then somehow you are also needing to dismantle what is architecture education. So I'm curious about your thoughts about that, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I think those who know me on this line probably know that 10 years ago we started a program in the city called Project Pipeline. That was a reference to a larger program with the National Organization for Minority Architects. But we had a very specific program here that was actively about social justice through design education. And the first programs were always with Tulane, and we always had a great deal of fun kind of working in that space. But that was the seeds of a larger conversation around how we kind of deinstitutionalize the frameworks of white supremacy in all of our work, right? It was the kind of early seedlings of it, but fundamentally it was about how we could rethink what we value in the course of education, but what we value in physical space, what we value in our physical environments, and then start to articulate that back into a new form or a new basis for what architecture can be. And even working with young people at that time, we would see things like, if we gave folks the kind of litany of programmatic elements that one might need in a neighborhood or a community, and again, we're talking about 8th graders to seniors, they would almost never have a police station in that environment. Almost never, right? I mean, I would say, of the 10 years we did it, I'd say maybe 2 or 3 years we had 1 or 2 projects that started to talk about that. What that says to me is that we understand what safety means different through our cultural lenses, and if we are adamantly bound to visions and systems of whiteness, and I mean that in the like systemic level, right? Then we will always negate the values of marginalized communities. So it's just by its very nature what will happen. And so cutting to present, when we think about kind of disconnecting or challenging the way that architecture schools run, there's a deep need for meritocracy to sustain itself in the academy. And I was on one of our faculty calls, and we talked about the fact that, I mean, just change what you give merit to, right? Like what is the, I mean, if we merit only a certain set of things, then we will continue to ask ourselves the question, well, why can't we, why is our system still racist? Well, it's because you keep valuing the same set of things in students, and you keep adding the same students to your roll call, because you don't understand how to merit or to value other forms of knowledge, other forms of kind of intellectual heft. Yeah. Craig, you were about to say something? Sorry, I cut you off.
No, I was just saying, when you were talking about other forms of knowledge, I was thinking knowledge, so much of what I read into your comments was knowledge as an experiential form, right? That one is, and that, so when you're talking about reshaping, or remaking architectural education, you're talking about valuing other forms of knowledge, right? You're talking about different products, right? You're talking about different products that at the end of the process are less about an auteur and more about the true engagement with the community, right? So that there's, and that's a different kind of student, to be perfectly honest with you. It's a different, and it could be a different kind of faculty member. I mean, that's so there's but it might start with saying that the outcomes have to be, and this is the future setting question, the outcomes have to be rethought, right? The outcomes are less about aesthetic merit and more about engagement with community needs, right? That might be a way of setting at the very outset, look, we're setting a different bar here, right? That says, these are the things that we actually value, and that, it is important to make objects that are compelling, because I actually believe that you can't exact change if you're making things that don't capture people's imagination. So I think that continues to be a part of it. But if it's the only part of making architectural form, it falls short of being able to engage in substantive change. I'm telling you stuff that you already know. Sorry.
I mean, I think
I'm repeating it.
No, I think it's great. I wanted to pull one note though, because I think, when we talk about, introducing or thinking about architectural form from the methodology, the forms by which we create architectural form, has essentially a singular track presently. And if we are able to, so for instance, our studio this year we had 10 people on our jury. 7 of them were from the community in which we were working.
Right.
One was a former mayor, right? I mean, like it was literally like when students are actually faced with the humanity and dignity of constituents and communities on the ground, it's an entirely different consideration, different conversation. And the architecture is fundamentally different because they're beholden to a different set of values, set of merits. That's huge. For me, I will never have a studio that does not have residents on the ground in it ever again, in the jury. So I would make that, if there's one thing I would say, is put real human beings on your juries. If you want to say like, what's the first thing you can do in an architectural studio? It's change your merit, what you value, and bring real human beings into the studio.
Which seems so common sense, and it seems so easy to do, and yet a lot of the design studios, as we see across the country and actually across the world, right? It's interesting to see then how, in a lot of cases, that's actually taken out, right? Like the kind of having people on the ground be part of the conversation, is actually missing. And I think that's also one thing that struck me, that I appreciated from your talk also, Bryan, is you were talking about narrative, which was also, you were saying, recentering, the narrative is actually to give voices to especially to people who do not have maybe had the because of structures of oppression, that they were not given the ability to speak out in the past or in different contexts. And I think that's also something that is, I think, very valuable to sort of highlight, as you're kind of like pointing out, about how giving that ability and giving a chance and opportunity for people in the community, for example, to be able to express their own voice is so crucial, and I think it's so fundamental in being able to then have like multiple narratives, that then ultimately then the kind of architecture that you create also is like of multiplicity. Like it's not just kind of like one thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's, that struck me also in terms of like how you're using narrative, and then how you're using it also in the kind of that's a strategy in being able to then to change the conversation.
Yeah. It's a tool for form making, right? For us, it is to say again, form follows fiction in a true
Right.
manner, right?
I'm looking at the questions which are rolling up, which is great. But I wonder whether we might switch gears slightly and, engage an audience we unfortunately can't see broadly, but they're out there, and there's some really interesting questions, which I assume everybody can read them. I don't know, Bryan, can you see them?
Yeah, I can see
I'm
them.
happy to read. Yeah, so, maybe we could start, because I think a lot of things we've been talking about are actually being followed up with questions from the audience.
Yeah, we can start with, you want to read one of them off? Which one you?
Sure, I'm going to just start at the top. Here's a question that says, you mentioned spatial aesthetic preferences being ingrained into communities of color as a result of both trauma and the evolution of their respective cultures. I think the question here is, do you think designers of color are taught and or learn to suppress these preferences as they move through their education and into the profession? How does this play into actively decolonizing architecture? So there are two questions in there.
Yeah. I mean, I think that design, I think that architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning, the kind of capital considerations of those things are so weighted that the given process of training Black and brown designers to create that type of architecture necessarily forces out the kind of cultural aspects that we ingrain in every other thing, whether that's music, whether that's our painting and art, visual arts and movies, and that we ingrain in literally everything else, doesn't necessarily see the light in architecture because of the kind of largesse of the capital consideration. And so I think there's a need to change values, not just because I think it's the kind of necessary shift in power that can happen from that response, but I do think that our ability to reconcile how form can follow fiction and to value that as a form-making typology or a form-making consideration gives us the ability to again reassess how we think about architecture moving forward. So I really truly do think that there's something important about that set of considerations. And I think the second question is, how does it play actively in decolonizing architecture? I mean, I think it's the whole thing, right? When we talk about like white supremacy, when we talk about like whiteness as a construct, we're talking about fission, and when we talk about mutualism, we're talking about fusion. Like whiteness as a construct, racism as a construct is one that feeds off of the disaggregation of individual elements to create its own power, right? It feeds off of the separation, the forceful separation, in order to create its own power, where we are looking for, and in order to decolonize, we are shifting to a system that actually feeds off of the active and forceful integration or connection of folks in order to create the power. That's where power lies. It's much harder to get to. It's much harder to maintain, but that's actually where power actually finds its root. And so I think decolonization requires an acknowledgement that power is created in a white supremacist system by forceful extraction, and it in a system of mutualism or pluralism, it requires those interactions to move forward.
It's interesting because in the broader use of the term, in the academy, decolonizing I'm thinking about it as it applies to the way in which you talk about your work is, that it is about providing subjects with the opportunity to tell their own stories, right? It is, in fact, that part of the process of decolonization is claiming your narrative, right? And being able to portray your narrative through the lens of your own experience, as opposed to having it portrayed for you by someone else. So I'm in some ways kind of generalizing a little bit about the process of decolonization or the larger operative strategy, but it seems as if it's applicable to the way in which you're thinking about both the work you do and the way in which you want to change praxis, if I could use the term, broadly.
Yeah, precisely.
It also reminds me, like, how the shift, like the narrative shifting in decolonization, there's also about shifting agency, like giving the agency to, let's say, the community who had been marginalized, to actually give them the ability to shape their own sort of futures, and you include that in the conversation, and include that in the process, like what you're doing with how, for example, with the projects that you showed, it's like you're allowing the community to be able to tell for themselves, like, what they want for their own futures to be. And I think that's also, really important.
It's huge. I mean, like, a friend of mine always talks about hip hop as the post-occupancy of modernism, right? It's post-occupancy report of modernism, right? Like, it's a way for us to understand the truth in the impacts of people on the ground. And I would extend that beyond hip hop to protest. I would extend that to organizing and activism. I would extend that to advocates who exist in these spaces, who have all been screaming from the top of their lungs since, for 200 years about these various topics. I mean, we're doing a book club presently. If y'all want to come, it's Dyrby on Twitter, DYRBRY. Did you read Black Reconstruction yet? And the intention is, like, if you read Black Reconstruction by W.B. Du Bois, you'll recognize that literally everything this man wrote in 1835 are still the same conversations we are having presently. And he articulates it so well that it's worth recognizing that people have been saying not sort of the same thing, not kind of generally the same thing, have been saying the same damn thing for 200 years. And I think that's, I think it's important to note, although that book was built, was first produced in 35. Folks before him were saying it as well. So that's the point of that statement.
Can I shift then to another question from Anna?
We were going to do the same.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
This is from Anna Deeg, and she asks, and she says, while I agree educating future architects about design justice is fundamental, architectural education seems to hold space for creative/progressive visionary/conversations that actually practice largely does not. So how can these systems be dismantled from actual practice? Firms that are complicitly ignoring the need to deconstruct our racist architectural culture.
That's a fantastic question, and I think maybe that was a spike or a volley to me to speak about a few other the projects that we're working on. One is, again, through the Anti-Racist Design Justice Index that we've built out with the DAP Collective, which you can check out at dapcollective.org. There is a way for us to actually start to hold firms, organizations, politicians accountable based on these considerations, right? So one of the things is that we actually have to pressure our firms and our organizations to actually sign on to commit to these sets of demands, and then ultimately provide the frameworks for people to articulate how their specific firm can get from point A to point B. So for instance, there was a letter that came out from the AIA New York this past year that I think in December or January that spoke to the ceasing of creating architectural the carceral state, right? To advocates for the carceral state. So the point of that was that through that organization, through AI in New York, it was looking to fundamentally shift its relationship to its practitioners and to the state that wants to kind of continue to produce these. Now it's a small step. It was a letter, but fundamentally it's something that reshifts the organizational framework or the DNA of the framework of the organization in order to push them further. Now, when it comes to practices in firms, there's a couple things that are really, really big that are happening presently that I would keep an eye out for. One is that there are a ton of organizations, specifically on the West Coast, that are starting to add design justice and critical race theory to their RFPs. So part of the way firms shift is by necessarily following how clients are actually asking to be represented in the world. They don't want firms that are applying racist tactics to their work. Now, that's a small batch of folks, but it's continuing to get bigger every year as we continue to see more RFPs come to our desk that include frameworks for critical race theory, frameworks for trauma-informed design, frameworks for design justice to be implemented as strategies within them. And then I think lastly, when we talk about how practices can specifically change, there is a need internally to shift, again, the outputs within the architectural process. So for our process, we actively have a ground setting phase and a baselining phase. Ground setting basically just allows us to kind of identify the sociocultural, sociopolitical parameters of space and the kind of geopolitical perimeters, right? So what are the boundaries that become obstacles to communities, marginalized communities, to activate or engage with the site? What are the sociocultural conditions that prevent communities from engaging with the site? We identify those early on. We make sure that our community organizing and engagement process goes from point A to point B. It's throughout the entirety of the architecture, all the way through the process from ground setting to CA. In a lot of our projects, we hire what we call community design advocates. So a project we're working on in Dallas, we've hired 10 community design advocates that are with us for a substantial amount of time. They are organizers, they are activists, they are kind of community members who are engaged in particular connected material to the architecture. And, you know, for some, they are formerly incarcerated, for some, they are formerly houseless, depending on what the architecture is. And they become the voice, one of the voices that help us define what this narrative is throughout the course of this project. And then lastly, we institute and implement what we call a design justice set. So this is an architectural set within the larger document set that fundamentally tracks and contains every larger narrative comment that we heard throughout the entirety of the process. And so we tag that to the architecture, and the decisions we made spatially are bound to those terms. We also note why we didn't do certain things. So if we just weren't able to do something, then that's also noted, and it holds us accountable. It holds our clients accountable, and yeah, I think it's worked. But all of these things have to continue to develop over time, and hopefully more people start to do them, and so we start to see kind of revolution in that. So.
We had two questions, one of which I think you might actually have answered, without having heard it. So that's, I know that you've got extraordinary powers, but dude, you answered the question. We didn't even ask it yet. So this was the question that I'm a big fan of community members on design juries, as a way to nudge, transform design education. How do we then change the profession to ensure community members have a say in projects? I think you got to that, but you might want to add coda.
Yeah, I mean, I would, the only additional thing I would add is you know, those who are disinherited from these processes should be on juries, and so I think actively seeking and putting RFPs out that that don't just have kind of those who hold power as the primary source, but have additional folks connected to it are the ones we want to, those are the RFPs that we actually, and we should actually say that as architects, we should be calling for these types of RFPs. We should be sending them, you know, when we get a good RFP, we should send that to other clients. This is what you should do the next time you actually put out an RFP for a project.
Right, because like it's the clients actually who will also the need to demand it later on, right? And so it has to be a conversation between the client and the architect.
And then also
right?
the cities need to say, look, I mean, your city councils, the mayors should be able to say essentially, this is, you know, this is actually what we want to see in our city. If you're not able to do this, then go away. That's the frame.
You know, it's an interesting, in the context of how one thinks about changing the profession, you know, we talked a little bit about what outcomes are. You know, outcomes are the project itself, but the other outcome might be skill sets that you leave with the community to be able to self-determine, right? That one of the things that might be critical in a reimagined architectural process is one in which not only do you leave the project, but you actually leave skills, right? That what you're charged with is building a set of skills that allow a community to self-determine, right? But because there's not always going to be the architect there when you need it. So, and some of that is, my sense is some of that is through the project itself. Some of that is through inspirational leadership to show the younger members of the community that if you want to actually control your community, maybe you're not a lawyer, maybe you're an architect.
Yeah. So self-determination is a call from every movement throughout the last 150 years, and that's absolutely correct. I mean, I think, you know, our ability to navigate that particular consideration is about the organizing space, right? What we talked about, the difference between outreach, engagement, and organizing. One is to self-determine, is to build power. I know there's one more question left. I can try to answer that if somebody wants to, or
please go ahead.
Okay. Does an architecture that gives agency back to those who have been marginalized and give them the power of space call for architects that work with designing of systems that facilitate participatory architecture rather than architects that design buildings? I think it requires both. This is a great question. So that continuum of power that we talked about earlier goes from pedagogy, policies, procedures, practice, projects, people. It requires us as designers to implement strategies that impact each of those categories. Now, our skill sets may only allow us to do certain ones well, but we should learn to be better at the kind of collective systems understanding. That means that we should change parts of the way that we teach ourselves, the pedagogy. We should think about the ways that we can implicitly and explicitly impact policies that are put in place. We should understand the difference between policy and procedure. That means that our practices needs to change and that our collective power building needs to happen in all of these processes. When I say that, I say just quickly looking at redlining. Redlining never called Black people, it never said Black people need to be segregated. It actually said undesirables, right? The policy, undesirables. It said in the procedure, Black people and Latinos, right? Like that's where the kind of framework for defining what undesirables meant. And so we as designers have to actually understand the full context of those histories and understand the larger systems and start to teach in with communities so that they understand those systems as well, so that they can actually put pressure points on the larger set of conversations. I'll shut up, Emily. I know I run a little long, and you know I could talk about this all day. So thank you.
No, I think it's great. I mean, part of me doesn't want to cut it off. Hey. But there is dinner and kids to feed.
Yeah.
Well, this has been amazing. I just want to mention for those tuning in that, you know, Bryan's got a lot of talks already uploaded to his website. There's links there, there's resources. You know, for those of you looking to dig deeper, that's a great launch point to find out more. And, you know, there's a network of folks who are like happy to provide resources, readings, lectures, have conversations, and these are some of those people, and there are more out there. So yeah, I wanted to thank you so much, Bryan, and also Craig and Edson for this conversation tonight. And
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you,
And
Bryan. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you,
so
Edson.
much.
Thank you, Bryan.
Yeah,
Such a
absolutely.
pleasure.
And
Thanks,
there's
y'all.
another
All
one
right.
coming up next Monday. Albert Pope has a lecture called A Promethean Increment. So join us then too.
We'll do.
All right.
All right, y'all. Be safe.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much.